I never thought strangers would carry my late husband's favourite chair out of my house while I was still wearing a hospital wristband. The cold November air hit my face as Ethan helped me slowly up the front walkway toward the house I had lived in for 42 years. My legs still felt weak after 3 days in the hospital with pneumonia, and all I wanted was tea, a blanket, and the familiar creak of Harold's old rocking chair near the living room window. Instead, I froze halfway up the driveway when I saw 2 men loading that very chair into the back of a moving truck. "Wait," I whispered, before my voice cracked harder than I expected. One of the movers paused awkwardly while holding the chair Harold used every evening before cancer took him away 6 years earlier. Olivia stepped onto the porch holding a tablet and coffee cup, like this was just another busy afternoon. "Oh, good you are home early," she said casually. The furniture buyers came ahead of schedule. I stared at her without understanding. "Furniture buyers?" Ethan rubbed the back of his neck uncomfortably beside me while avoiding eye contact. Olivia walked down the porch steps confidently in expensive boots that clicked sharply against the stone walkway. "Margaret, the house needed updating," she explained with a tight smile. Nobody wants heavy, outdated furniture anymore. My chest tightened as another mover carried out the oak bookshelf Harold built with his own hands during our first winter in this house. Family photo albums were stacked carelessly inside cardboard boxes beside the garage. "You sold my things?" I asked quietly. Olivia crossed her arms and sighed impatiently. "Honestly, Margaret, they were just collecting dust." Then I noticed something else through the open front door that made my stomach drop completely. The entire living room was gone. I stood silently inside the doorway while cold air drifted through the house behind me, and for a moment I honestly felt like I had walked into a stranger's property instead of the home Harold and I spent our entire marriage building together. The floral curtains I sewed 30 years earlier were gone. The antique lamp from my mother's dining room had disappeared. Even the pale green wallpaper Harold insisted on keeping because it reminded him of our first apartment had already been ripped halfway down, exposing bare drywall underneath. Olivia stepped carefully around paint samples scattered across the hardwood floor, while speaking with the confidence of someone giving a luxury home tour. "We are opening up the space and making everything brighter," she explained, while pointing toward the empty living room. "Modern buyers love clean lines now." I looked toward Ethan, hoping he would finally say something, but he only sighed tiredly and carried my hospital bag upstairs. "Mum," he said quietly without turning around, "Olivia is just trying to help the house feel updated." Updated. The word sat heavy in my chest because nothing inside this house had ever been about trends. Every object carried years of birthdays, Christmas mornings, arguments, apologies, and late-night conversations after Harold lost his job during the recession. Olivia picked up one of my framed wedding photographs from a cardboard box beside the kitchen. "Do you want me to store these in the basement?" she asked casually. I walked over slowly and took the frame from her hands before answering. This was never storage to me. For the first time, Olivia's polished smile slipped slightly. Then a man wearing a contractor jacket walked through the front door, holding blueprints under his arm. "Mrs. Hayes," he said cheerfully while looking at Olivia. "Before demolition starts tomorrow morning, I just need the homeowner's final signature." Ethan froze halfway down the staircase. Olivia immediately reached for the paperwork, but the contractor looked directly at me instead. The contractor kept holding the paperwork toward me, while Olivia's expression tightened almost instantly. Actually, I have been handling The renovation decisions, she said quickly, as she stepped forward to take the folder from his hands. The contractor hesitated awkwardly. I understand, Mum, but company policy requires the legal homeowner to approve structural demolition. The room became painfully quiet after those words. Ethan slowly came back down the staircase, carrying my hospital bag while looking between all of us, like he already sensed trouble building beneath the surface. Olivia forced a laugh that sounded sharper than before. Margaret is recovering from the hospital. Ethan and I are taking care of everything now. I watched her carefully while she spoke, because, for the first time since coming home, I noticed something underneath her confidence. Nervousness. The contractor shifted uncomfortably beside the front door. I am sorry, but the permit application lists Mrs. Margaret Hayes as primary owner. Ethan blinked hard. What? Olivia immediately grabbed the paperwork from the contractor and flipped through the pages quickly. That cannot be right, she muttered. My son frowned while stepping closer beside her. I thought Dad transferred the house to us years ago. I felt exhaustion settling deeper into my chest, but I kept my voice calm. Your father never transferred anything. Olivia looked up so fast I almost felt the panic hit the room physically. Then why are Ethan and I paying property taxes? She demanded. Because I allowed it, I answered quietly. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Outside, the moving truck doors slammed shut while another piece of my life disappeared down the driveway. Ethan rubbed both hands across his face. Mum, why would you never tell us this? Before I could answer, my eyes landed on a familiar wooden box sitting half open near the garage entrance. My stomach dropped immediately, because inside that box were Harold's handwritten letters, the only thing I asked never to be touched. And Olivia had already marked the box with a bright red sticker that said, Donation. I walked toward the garage box slowly, because suddenly, the missing furniture no longer hurt as much as seeing Harold's letters treated like junk waiting for strangers to carry away. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the lid and saw dozens of envelopes tied carefully with blue ribbon, exactly the way he used to keep them inside our bedroom drawer. Olivia noticed my expression and immediately crossed her arms defensively. Margaret, they were sitting in old boxes for years, she said impatiently. I was trying to clean things up. I looked down at the handwriting on one envelope, dated 1987, the year Ethan nearly died from pneumonia at age 6. Harold wrote me letters every night during those hospital weeks because he worked double shifts and could not always stay beside me. These are not clutter, I said quietly. Olivia sighed loudly while the contractor pretended to study his paperwork near the front door. You cannot expect the house to stay frozen in the 1990s forever. Ethan finally stepped forward. Olivia, maybe we should slow down. She turned toward him immediately. Slow down? She repeated sharply. We already paid $20,000 for renovations. My son rubbed his forehead tiredly while avoiding my eyes again. I realized then that neither of them truly understood what they had touched, because none of this was about furniture. It was about memory, about belonging, about erasing someone slowly until the house no longer carried proof they ever lived there at all. I carefully gathered Harold's letters against my chest and walked back into the stripped living room, where pale rectangles still marked the walls where family photographs once hung. The silence inside the house felt colder than the November air outside. Then Olivia suddenly spoke again, with frustration creeping into her voice. Honestly, Margaret, if the house legally belongs to you, then maybe we should finally discuss selling it altogether. Ethan looked up instantly. But before either of us could respond, the front doorbell rang, and the contractor quietly whispered something that made Olivia's face lose colour completely. "There is an attorney here asking for Mrs. Hayes." The attorney stepped inside, carrying a black leather folder, protected carefully beneath his coat from the snow outside, and the moment I saw him, my stomach tightened, because I recognized Richard Coleman immediately. He had handled every legal document Harold prepared during the final months before cancer took him away. Olivia straightened her posture instantly, while Ethan looked completely confused. "There must be some misunderstanding," Olivia said quickly before Richard could even speak. Richard removed his gloves calmly and looked directly at me first. "Mrs. Hayes, I apologize for arriving unannounced, but after the renovation permits were filed, our office was notified automatically." Olivia frowned. "Notified about what exactly?" Richard slowly opened the folder across the stripped dining room table where my family photographs used to sit every Christmas morning. "About changes being made to property held under the Hayes Family Residential Trust." Ethan stared blankly. "What trust?" Richard paused briefly before answering. "Your father created the trust 11 years ago after the company nearly collapsed during the recession." The room became perfectly silent, except for the sound of snow tapping softly against the windows. I watched Ethan's face carefully as realization began forming piece by piece. Richard continued in the same calm, professional tone. "Under the trust agreement, Mrs. Margaret Hayes became sole owner of this property, along with controlling shares of Hayes Hardware Distribution after your father's death." Olivia's face drained completely of colour. "Controlling shares?" she whispered. Richard nodded once. "Mrs. Hayes currently owns 51% of the company, as well as the residence itself." Ethan looked at me like he no longer recognized his own mother. "Mom, you own the company?" I folded Harold's letters quietly in my hands before answering. "Your father wanted to make sure nobody could ever force me out of my own home." Olivia suddenly stepped backward against the kitchen counter in stunned silence. Then Richard reached deeper into the folder and placed another document carefully onto the table. "There is one more detail you all need to see." Richard slid the final document across the dining room table slowly, and for the first time since he arrived, even he seemed uncomfortable delivering what came next. Ethan picked up the papers first, while Olivia leaned over his shoulder, reading every line faster and faster, until her breathing visibly changed. "No," she whispered suddenly. "That cannot be right." Ethan looked up at Richard in disbelief. "If Mum controls the company, then why have I been acting as regional director all these years?" Richard adjusted his glasses carefully before answering. "Because Mrs. Hayes allowed it under temporary management authorization after your father passed away." Olivia stepped away from the table completely now, pacing across the stripped living room, where half-torn wallpaper still hung from the walls. "Temporary?" she repeated sharply. "Ethan has worked there for 15 years. Richard nodded calmly. "And the authorization expires automatically if actions are taken against the primary trustee's interests or residents." Nobody spoke for several seconds, because suddenly every missing chair, every contractor, every renovation invoice inside the house carried a completely different meaning. Ethan looked physically sick now. "Mum, are you saying we could lose everything over this?" I watched him quietly, while holding Harold's letters against my chest. "I never wanted that." Olivia spun around instantly. "Then why hide all of this from us?" Her voice cracked with panic for the first time since I returned home. I stayed calm because anger no longer seemed necessary. "Because your father knew exactly how people change once they believe something belongs to them. Olivia's eyes filled with frustration and fear while she looked around the empty living room, like she no longer recognized the house, either. Then Richard cleared his throat softly and opened another page inside the folder. There is also the matter of the unauthorized furniture sale. Olivia froze completely. What matter? Richard looked directly at her now. Several of those items were protected estate assets, specifically listed inside the trust inventory. Ethan slowly lowered himself into one of the folding contractor chairs as the meaning of those words finally hit him. Olivia grabbed the trust inventory papers from the table so quickly the pages almost tore in her hands. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, while scanning the document with growing panic. It was old furniture. Nobody said any of it was protected. Richard remained perfectly calm. The inventory was attached to the trust agreement filed years ago. Ethan stared at the list silently until his eyes stopped on one line near the bottom. "Dad's rocking chair," he read quietly. The room suddenly felt smaller after that, because we all remembered the sound that chair made every evening while Harold watched baseball games beside the fireplace. Olivia shook her head immediately. How was I supposed to know some ugly chair had legal value? I looked at her carefully, then because, for the first time all afternoon, she no longer sounded confident. She sounded scared. "It was not the chair," I answered softly. "It was your complete lack of respect." Ethan closed his eyes briefly, like the words physically hurt him. Olivia turned toward me again, frustration rising into anger. "Respect?" she said sharply. "I have spent years trying to fix this house while you kept everything trapped in the past." I stepped closer slowly while holding Harold's letters against my chest. "No, Olivia. You were trying to erase every trace that someone else lived here before you." The silence afterward cut deeper than shouting ever could. Even the contractor quietly slipped outside without speaking. Ethan looked around the stripped living room with a completely different expression now. Not annoyance. Shame. Olivia crossed her arms tightly. "So what happens now?" Richard answered before I could. "Legally, Mrs. Hayes may demand compensation for the sold estate property and revoke residential privileges attached to the trust." Olivia's face lost all color again. Ethan stared directly at me for the first time all day. "Mum, are you asking us to leave?" I looked toward the empty corner where Harold's chair once stood and realized the answer would change all our lives forever. The question hung in the stripped living room, heavier than anything else that afternoon. Ethan stood motionless beside the dining table, while Olivia looked at me with a mixture of anger, fear, and disbelief, like she was waiting for me to finally become the cruel old woman she had quietly imagined all these years. But I was too tired for cruelty. I slowly placed Harold's letters back inside the wooden box and looked around the house that no longer felt familiar. "I am not asking anyone to leave tonight," I said quietly. Ethan exhaled so sharply I realized he had been holding his breath. Olivia, however, did not look relieved. She looked ashamed. Richard gathered the trust documents calmly, while the snow outside continued falling harder against the windows. "Mrs. Hayes still has full authority to make future residential decisions," he reminded them gently before closing the folder. Ethan finally spoke again. "Mum, why did Dad never tell me any of this?" I studied my son carefully, because suddenly he no longer looked like an angry grown man defending his wife. He looked like the frightened little boy who once slept beside our bed during thunderstorms. "Because your father knew money changes how people listen," I answered softly. Olivia sat down slowly onto one of the contractor folding chairs while staring at the empty living room walls. "I thought you wanted us to take over eventually," she admitted quietly. "You never said no." I nodded once. "Because I thought you still understood this was our family home and not just another investment property." Nobody argued after that. The silence inside the house finally sounded different now. Not hostile. Broken. Then Ethan suddenly noticed something near the garage doorway, and his entire expression changed again. The movers were returning, carrying Harold's rocking chair back toward the front porch because the payment for the furniture sale had just been cancelled. That evening, the house felt strangely quiet again as the movers carefully placed Harold's rocking chair back beside the living room window where it had always belonged. Snow covered the front yard in soft white layers while Ethan helped carry the old oak bookshelf inside without saying very much. Olivia stayed near the kitchen most of the night, folding family photographs back into their frames with red eyes and trembling hands. Nobody mentioned renovation plans anymore. Nobody talked about modernizing the house. Around midnight, I finally sat down in Harold's chair, with his letters resting in my lap, while the fireplace crackled softly across the room. Ethan stood silently near the hallway watching me for several long seconds before speaking. "I really thought I was protecting my family," he admitted quietly. I looked at my son, and for the first time all day, I no longer saw the angry defensive man from earlier. I saw regret. Real regret. "You forgot this was already your family long before money entered the conversation," I answered softly. Olivia slowly walked into the living room, holding the framed wedding photograph she almost sent to the basement. "I am sorry, Margaret," she whispered, with tears finally sliding down her face. "I thought making the house look expensive would make it feel more valuable." I gently took the photograph from her hands and looked down at Harold smiling beside me 42 years earlier. "A home becomes valuable when people inside it feel respected," I said quietly. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt warmer somehow. Outside, snow continued falling across the dark neighborhood, while inside the house slowly began looking like itself again. And as I sat there, listening to the familiar creak of Harold's chair beneath me, I realized something simple but painful. Losing furniture never frightened me nearly as much as losing the feeling that I still belonged inside my own home.